please feel free to add them to the chat. Joy will be monitoring those throughout, and we will leave time to answer those questions, some of those questions at the end. So if you have questions, please add those there. Also, this is part of SPJ Truth Day, and the hashtag you can use for the event is hashtag SPJ Truth. First, I'll introduce myself again and have Joy introduce herself. My name is Lynn Walsh. I'm the Assistant Director of the Trusting News Project. Prior to joining Trusting News, I worked primarily in local television as an investigative journalist. I'm also a former national president for SPJ and a former ethics chair for SPJ. And Joy.
Hi guys, I started Trusting News in 2016, and before that I worked primarily in newspapers, and I taught at the Missouri School of Journalism, and my focus for a while has been on audience and community engagement, and I'm based in Sarasota, Florida. Nice to see you here today.
Great, and so today we're going to be talking about how to respond to misinformation while defending your journalism. And before we start talking about that, I think it is really important to have an understanding of what people think of the news, and something at Trusting News that we have a lot of research that we have done, but also that we have gathered from other researchers that look at this question. And a couple of the highlights: more Americans have a negative than a positive view of the news media, while 23% are neutral. And fewer than half of Americans say they can think of a news source that reports the news objectively. And that comes from a 2018 poll from the Knight Foundation and Gallup. Another quick kind of view of where trust in news stands. This is something that Gallup does every year. And the question they ask news consumers is, in general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as newspapers, TV, radio? And they say people get to choose and say if they have a great deal, a fair amount, not very much, or none at all. This graph shows the percentage of people who say they have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in news media. And as you can see, it has kind of consistently been on the decline for years. We hit the lowest point in 2016, and we've rebounded a little bit since then. And currently it stands at 41% of people who say that they have a fair amount or a great deal of trust in mass media. So you might be thinking, okay, we're talking about misinformation, we're talking about disinformation and how to respond. So why does it matter? Why should we know where trust stands in journalism and in media? Well, it matters because misinformation and disinformation thrive in information voids. So when people have questions and they don't know the answer to something, they might go search it on Google. They might go search it on another search engine. Maybe they turn to Facebook or a news app. If they don't find their answer, normally what happens is there might be some people out there answering the question. Maybe they're answering it but not based in facts. Maybe it's someone's opinion that pops up on YouTube. And so when there aren't kind of solid answers out there that people can find, this is where conspiracy theories thrive, when there isn't this information. And so misinformation and disinformation are thriving in these information voids. An example of this, kind of a really, I think, really compelling and kind of eye-opening example to this, is one of the most searched questions after the first Brexit vote was, what is the European Union? And if you think about that, imagine if people weren't able to find that answer, right? If people were, when they searched this, what is the European Union? What if they weren't able to find good, concrete news articles and data and facts about what the European Union is? And so when we're thinking about these information voids, this also is a reminder that we have to get down to kind of basic questions and being able to answer basic questions for our audience and for our communities. And when that comes to elections, that's how to vote, where to vote, how does mail-in voting work, how does the Electoral College vote? Some of these very basic questions, we need to make sure that we're kind of filling that void with good, credible, factual information and ethical reporting so that they find our information before maybe they find other misinformation, disinformation, or these conspiracy theories. So let's fill the information void. That's kind of the first kind of thing that we can help combat misinformation and disinformation, is by filling this information void and thinking about, when you look at that Brexit example, what are some questions that people may have? They might be very, very basic, but what are those questions and how can we fill that void, and how can we kind of put those explainers out there so that they're searchable? And I think the other thing is sometimes we as journalists, we write these things and we think, oh, we already covered that, or we did that story 2 weeks ago. Well, is it easy to find? Are we linking to it with all of our coverage? And those are some things that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to fill the information void, because if we don't, others will. And that's where some of these conspiracy theories thrive, the misinformation, the disinformation might come from. They might not, when people are searching for these questions, if they can't find credible information, they might find other information, someone's opinion that's out there, someone who maybe made up something, maybe something that was supposed to be satirical in nature that fills that void for them, but it's not factual information and it could be potentially dangerous. So if we don't fill the information void, others will. But more importantly, if people don't trust us, they're not going to turn to us. So if we are producing all of this ethical reporting, we're producing factual, accurate information that has context. But if people don't trust us, they're not going to turn to us to get it. So we need to build this trust so that they will turn to us in this time of need when they need answers. And that is why at Trusting News, we do find it so important to focus on building trust and being aware of where trust stands with your community.
So the first step there, we're going to go through some steps we hope you guys will take and consider incorporating into your strategies when it comes to showing that your work is credible and debunking misinformation that's swirling. So the first step is to monitor and just know what people in your community are talking about. What are they seeing in their feeds? What are people passing along? So that you can decide how to address it as a newsroom. So the first step is to monitor, and we're going to talk first about, I want to be clear about the difference between misinformation and disinformation. They're often used interchangeably, and that can sometimes work, but misinformation is just something that is wrong, false or inaccurate information that is communicated regardless of what the intention of that information is. So if it's accidentally wrong or just sort of like, it's sloppy, then that is misinformation. Disinformation more specifically is about the intent to deceive. And so that's more dangerous because if somebody is intending to deceive, a lot of times they might have a mechanism behind them that is strategic about how to get that information to spread. They might be intentionally trying to cause chaos or, thwart sort of an information process. So as journalists are trying to decide, once you have found false claims that are circulating and you're trying to decide what to do with them, this is such a helpful resource from our the folks at First Draft. We have taught with them and worked with them a lot in this lead up to the election, and they have so many smart tips about finding and rooting out mis and disinformation. The really powerful concept called the tipping point that addresses, like, obviously there's a really solid instinct in newsrooms that we don't report on every rumor. So every single person who calls the newsroom and says, I heard they're tearing down City Hall tonight, right? Like, you don't just start reporting on that. I heard this candidate dropped out. But the question of, like, when is it worth reporting? This is a really helpful checklist that can help you decide whether it's worth reporting. So how much engagement has the rumor received? Like, as you watch something spread, is it getting shared a lot? Are you seeing it pop up in a lot of places? Is the discussion limited to one community? Like, if it seems pretty insular so far, maybe that's something you can address it in that specific case, but not necessarily cover it for your wider audience. Has the rumor jumped platforms? Like, is it something that maybe started on Reddit and now you're seeing it pop up on Facebook or in other channels? Did someone with a lot of influence share it? Once, if your congressman is passing something along, that's probably a good sign that it has entered mainstream conversation and that it's worthwhile for you to debunk it. And then have other large media outlets covered the rumor. So yes, your instinct and your hope that you can just ignore it is sometimes valid. If something has not gotten a lot of traction, go ahead and give into that urge. But if something has gotten a lot of attention, it's really important to point out when something is inaccurate and show examples of how it's spreading. So one really prominent way this has topic that this has become a question about recently is in coverage of QAnon. When does a movement, a conspiracy theory like QAnon, reach such a point that mainstream journalists need to start telling people what it is, why they're hearing about it, and what false premise it's based on? So our newsroom partners are the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where they actually have a congressional candidate who has been a QAnon supporter, wrote a really lengthy story saying, here's what this is and here's what it looks like as it takes root in Georgia. In part of that story, they just said, what is this conspiracy theory that says Donald Trump is at war with a deep state pedophile ring? Like, when you actually type this, it's really important to just type this out, like in like neutral language, like here's what these people say, here's what the claim is, and then you can sort of put it in context and pull back from it. What we really love to see is when reporting like this doesn't just stay in a one-off story, but migrates to all future coverage. So could you take something like this section of a story that just says, here's what QAnon is, tighten it a little and make it a box that runs with every single time QAnon is mentioned in a future story. Or maybe you have it handy so that every time you post a story on Facebook that mentions QAnon, you leave that as the first comment, that just as a reminder, here's what this theory is. So we really believe in redundancy in that case. Like, once you've done the work of clearing something up, be sure that you reintroduce people to it at every opportunity. The next thing we really encourage you to do, besides do your own sort of monitoring of online conversation, you can't be everywhere. And we absolutely know how busy you are and how impossible it would be to eavesdrop on all public conversation happening in your community. So we really advise you to think through how you could ask for your community's help. That does a couple of things. It reinforces for them that you stand on the side of facts, like that you care, that you are watching for misinformation and that you want to see it. And it also empowers them to help you and just create sort of a feedback loop of that, a news tip. So think about how you can turn your engaged audience members into a team of scouts, inviting them to let you know when they've seen something that they think warrants attention, either from like just general election, how's your voting going kind of tips, or more specifically misinformation, what claims are you seeing circulating online? So this is an example from Minnesota Public Radio. We're going to show you a few examples from a really fantastic project they have in covering mis and disinformation and sort of news literacy, inviting their community to just be more empowered, smarter news consumers. And they have a section where you can submit tips. So it's powered by a really great tool called Typeform, but it basically says, what are you seeing online? Can you send us a screen grab of it? Can you send us a URL? Can you tell us how to find you so that we can ask you more questions about this if we want to? And it's a really simple form folks can go through. This could take a lot of platforms. It could be a Google form. It could just be an email line. It could be an audio tip line if that makes sense for your newsroom. Whatever format you, whatever feedback loop you open, just make sure that you're going to keep monitoring and that you shut it down when you're not going to keep monitoring, so that people don't send you tips and then you're forgetting to check and they don't ever hear from you and it doesn't ever get addressed. But it really can be quite simple. That could be a comment you leave under stories, like if you're covering the election, covering this information, have a comment ready that you leave under each story on your website, on Facebook, that says, if you see things, examples of false claims circulating online, we hope you'll share it with us. Our partners at PolitiFact also have a similar form where they ask for readers to suggest claims to fact check, and they're really pretty assertive about issuing this invitation to folks at every opportunity. Here's how we work to be fair. Here's how we fact check people across the political spectrum. We're watching, we're fact checking the debate tonight. We're watching for claims to fact check. If you see one that we missed, or if you see something that you would like our team of fact checkers to address, here's how you can let us know. And then they often assign those to reporters. And then they also circle back with the source and say, thanks so much. Here's the answer to the question that you raised.
So the next thing that we encourage journalists to do is to respond. So when we're going to talk about that, Joy mentioned the tipping point, like when do you respond? So let's say you've kind of gone through these questions and you're like, okay, we should be addressing this misinformation, disinformation, and or we should be defending our work when people are accusing us of having misinformation or spreading fake news, as it sometimes you might be accused of from your audience. And so the first thing is to ask yourself, are you fighting misinformation? If the answer is yes, which we hope the answer is yes, tell your audience that. Something that I think is just, when you take a step back, having worked in a newsroom, you're just moving at such a fast pace. But when you take that step back, which I've had the opportunity to do now, you realize we do so many things, but we never tell our audience like these things that we're doing. And so we just assume that they know that we're doing all these things. But guess what? They don't. And so we need to tell people. And that's what we have found at Trusting News, is even sometimes just telling people that we're doing these things, like fighting misinformation, can be extremely helpful. And so here's an example of what that might look like, speaking directly to your audience about that. In this example, the newsroom says, we stand for facts and truth. We know the information health of our community is important for our overall public health these days, especially. That means we investigate rumors circulating in the community. We delete misinformation when it appears in comments on our website and on social media. We also ask for your help in alerting us to claims that might be causing needless panic or uncertainty. So this paragraph really, I think, encompasses kind of all of this kind of telling of your audience. They're saying, one, they're talking about what they stand for, which is facts and truth. They're talking about why monitoring this is important, because it's the information health of the community. And then they also talk about how they're investigating rumors, how they delete misinformation, and also that they ask for help. And again, just saying this can really kind of send the message to your audience, like, we're taking this very seriously. We take giving you information, credible information, very seriously. And I also love that they talk about and do involve their community, because that again says, this is a group effort. We want your help. We want you to be part of the solution. Maybe you are accused of having a liberal bias. So when we talk about maybe some of these accusations of being fake news, something else though that does come up often, especially related to elections and politics, is that people might say, oh, it's just the liberal media. So we do think that it is important to respond to those accusations. One thing to keep in mind is when it might just be one comment on Facebook, it might be one comment on Twitter, maybe it's one comment on your website under a story. And you think, oh, well, why should I respond to that person that's calling us the liberal media? Well, remember, if you do respond publicly, you're not just responding to that one individual, you're responding more broadly to anyone who might be reading that. And we find that that is very helpful, because it's letting other people know, not just that one person, and it's not just letting that one person's comment or view, which is incorrect, stand as true. So here's an example of how you could respond to an accusation that you are just the liberal media or you have a liberal bias. And I really like this because the first sentence, basically, the journalist is saying, we hear you. We know it can be frustrating when you're looking at political coverage, and it can be frustrating because it seems that a lot of political coverage is biased. And then they say, but we are constantly evaluating what our election coverage looks like. And our goal is always to provide you with the information you need to have a clear understanding of the issues. And then they say they give the viewers more information about how they can read about their goals and ethics. They also talk about then how they strive for fairness and accuracy. And then they also offer them to give more specific feedback. So a couple things with this, if you're responding to a complaint like that, if the complaint or accusation is very broad, try to get the person to be more specific. Like, is there a specific example where they feel that there was this liberal bias? That can definitely help you have a better conversation with the individual and talk about these issues publicly. The other thing is to keep in mind, yes, this is frustrating. Responding in general can be frustrating, but take a deep breath and try. I know Joy and I, we are in line with this. We like to try to give people the benefit of the doubt. And try to say, like, this is an opportunity for education and to have a conversation. And it's not just that someone is out to make us have a bad day, right? While it may come off as a criticism, maybe it's an opportunity to explain something to them that they may not know. So yes, it's frustrating, but do take a deep breath before responding, and come back when you're kind of more clear-headed and ready to kind of respond in a way of mutual kind of respect, understanding to those accusations. When we also are responding to complaints about misinformation, disinformation, fake news, liberal media, it's really important to talk about your process and ethics. And in this example, you can see that they did link in their response to where people could get more information about their goals and ethics. And that's really important because, again, it shows what your values are, and it can basically kind of put away maybe misassumptions that people may have in their head about your work, because you're actually explaining to them what your policies are. So some of those process and ethics that you may want to respond might be around sourcing, how you work to be fair, story selection. So many people wonder why we cover one story and don't cover another. Talk about that, especially around elections. Why are you covering maybe so much of this candidate or this race, but they're not seeing anything about another race? Explain that. If you don't, they might make an assumption. Generally, that assumption is going to be negative. Talk about your relationship to wire content. If you're getting content from the Associated Press, from Reuters, talk about any content that might come down from a corporate entity. Maybe you're a part of USA Today and there's certain content that you're running or that you actually locally don't have control of, but you do run. Explain what that relationship is. Also talk about how you do fact check. In that first example that we had with responding, I think was a good example of that. Here's how we are looking for misinformation and what we do when we see it. One way that you could do this, first let's talk about where those explanations can go. So they can go as an editor's note at the top of a story. They could be a separate whole story that you write about. Here's how we approach election results. Here's how we're going to determine who wins the election, right? You could create a newsletter and or add this content to existing newsletters. You also could add this to social posts. So when you're sharing a story on social, instead of just pulling a quote from the story or resharing the headline, you could add a little bit of information behind maybe some decision making that went into the story, or why you chose to do the story in the first place when you share the link to the story. This can work on air, and we've worked with some television stations as well. It could be an anchor or reporter intros and tags, or it could be boxes within stories. And this is something that at Trusting News, we have done some research on. We call it an explain your process box. And the idea here is that you answer some of those questions. For this research, we did some A/B testing where we had one story that did not have the box, and then we had that same story that did have a box. And in this case, it was a crime story, and the reporters in the box would answer questions like why and how you're covering this topic, how we're doing the story, and our approach to covering crime. So one story published without the box, and then we had another story that we showed people that had the box added. And what they are doing is they're answering some of those questions about the story inside the story. So this is embedded within the other text of the story. And what we found through our research with the A/B testing is that the presence of these explain your process boxes boosted people's perception of the news organization on 11 of 12 items related to trust. And those items included that news organization, when the box was present, they felt that that news organization was more transparent, was more informative, provided more accurate content, was more fair. They told the whole story. They were more reliable. They were more credible. They provided more accurate content. And so this is kind of research that shows this does work and can work. And here's an example from the San Francisco Chronicle, and they talk about how this is related to, so here's an explain your process box. You can see it right here, how the story was reported. It was embedded kind of in the middle of the story. This specifically talks about sourcing. The story was about Rudy Giuliani, and they talk about, how this reporter when this reporter began looking into Rudy Giuliani's cybersecurity role. So 2017, right? This is when the reporter began looking into Rudy Giuliani. The story didn't publish till 2020, so kind of showing how long they've been looking at this. And then they talk a little bit about who they talked to get information, where they went to get information. So he says he talks to sources. He also filed Freedom of Information Act request. And so this is just a good example of how you can embed a box and talk about some of those ethics and some of those process decisions that you make within a story. And specifically related to elections, talking about your sourcing can be really, really important, because people might have lots of questions about why you turn to this expert versus another expert, or why you're talking about this poll versus another poll. So explain that within the story when you have their attention and when they're reading the content. And something to think about, if you're not getting credit for your careful processes and your public service journalism, it's really up to you. It's up to us to tell a better story about what we do. As journalists, I think we think, okay, we're just going to report a great story and we're going to put it out there and that's all we need to do. But if we made all these careful decisions and we talked through these different ethical situations, no one's going to know we did that unless we tell people. And so if we don't tell them, they're going to read the story and they might make assumptions about us not doing those things or not asking those questions. And they're not going to give us credit for all that hard work that we do. So it really is up to us to tell this story. And that's why we at Trusting News really encourage you to explain some of this ahead of time. So be proactive instead of just having to react and always explain yourself. Here's another example when we talk about fake news. This is a great example from the News Tribune, and they just kind of said, we hate fake news too, just kind of very in your face, just like saying, we don't like it. And they say, in the post, so the graphic is there, we hate fake news. On the post, they said, fake news culture is real. We don't want to be a part of it. We're invested in maintaining our community's trust. So then they link and they say, here's our mission and our values in Jefferson City, where you can read more about that. Another example here from the Gazette, they talk about how they are a locally owned news organization, and they tell stories of life in Eastern Iowa. Their only agenda is to provide accurate, useful, and compelling information. So that's really important too, that focus on local, and saying that, their agenda, their only agenda, which is a word that maybe we get news consumers use, but we don't use as journalists, is to provide accurate, useful, and compelling information. Here are some other examples of how to respond to misinformation accusations. This is from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and there was a protest, and the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel was accused of altering an image that they used because there were two men dressed very similarly. One was holding a Confederate flag, one was holding a different flag. And so when the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel posted a photo in their story, mentioned that there was a man with a Confederate flag, other people in the community were like, no, that man was not holding a Confederate flag. I have a picture of him right here, and he has a different flag in his hand. And so what they did is they said, well, actually, there were two men there. And here are the two men. They were able to use video to show, here are the two men. You can see they look very similar. We do not alter photos. That absolutely is not an altered image. That person, there was someone there with a Confederate flag. There also was someone else similarly dressed with another flag. And so kind of tackling it head on and being willing to explain and walk people through the process, while also tying it back to the fact that, again, we would not alter that image. That is not something that we do. Here's an example from the Coloradoan. This is related to coronavirus, but they, in their Facebook groups and pages, basically have taken a hard stance that they are going to remove content that is speculation regarding coronavirus. They want people to have confirmed, reliable information. So that's what will be shared on the page. And they encourage people that if you do have something that's unconfirmed, or you have a question about something you're unsure, send us a news tip, send us a private message, but don't post it here in this group because we will delete it. We only want accurate, verified information here. Another example here, how to respond to misinformation accusations. This comes from a reporter in Jacksonville. And right as the beaches were opening back up, kind of early on in the coronavirus pandemic, there were kind of people talking about, oh, beaches are so crowded. And then others were questioning those images. And so what this reporter decided to do was show people, okay, here are all the different views that I had as a reporter out there on the beach. And here's what they look like. Here's my view with my iPhone of the photo I took. Here's what it looks like from the sky when we had the helicopter going over. Here's what it looks like zoomed out. Here's what it looks like zoomed in. And he kind of walked people through how, depending on an angle or a perspective, or a camera lens that you might be using, you might see different photos, but that doesn't mean that another photo isn't accurate. And he also talked about, how they do work to kind of show the most accurate information. They're not kind of going out there to show a skewed perspective, but that sometimes you might see something that shows, oh, one area of an empty beach, but that's not maybe the whole picture. And they're trying to show the whole picture. And here's what that looks like. This last example that we want to share with you here comes from, this was a story that Colorado Public Radio did related to the cost of art at the Denver International Airport. And when the story was published, a group called the Colorado Union of Taxpayers shared the story on Facebook and said, Colorado taxpayers pay for this junk. Well, the journalist behind the story saw that this was shared, and he said, hey guys, here's who I am. This is actually my story. I appreciate you sharing it. But one point of clarification, Denver International Airport does not use taxpayer dollars for its public art. So here's an organization kind of taking a headline and kind of resharing it out of context, and it's actually not correct. So the reporter corrects them, but then also says, I've actually been looking for sources to offer a different perspective. Is there someone from your organization that can talk to me? And so next, Joy is going to talk about using labels.
So I think that as we think about how hard it is to underlying a lot of the tips we're sharing with you guys is sort of an empathy for the experience of consuming news these days and how complicated it is to figure out what you're looking at. And I want to talk about labels, especially for opinion content, because the experience, I get super frustrated, and I'm going to guess you guys too, when you are, maybe you're listening to something, watching something, reading something, and you're like, oh my gosh, people don't even understand that this is a column. I was teaching recently a room full of opinion journalists, and they were commiserating about how they all get accused of having too much bias. They're like, that's my job. It's literally my job to share my take on the world, right? And yet people don't understand that. One newsroom we work with, we did a newsroom survey, and somebody said on the survey, you need to fire your restaurant reviewer. She's too biased. So people don't understand that some journalists are paid to share their opinion. We make it really, really tough for people to tell whether content is designed to persuade them of something, to share a personal take or lens on the world, or purely to inform them or to help them analyze something. So I think it's natural to be confused about this, and that is on us. There are plenty of places where it isn't clear and where I think news and opinion are much too enmeshed. Plenty of places where there's a panel of talking heads on TV, and I can watch for a few minutes and genuinely not be sure who here is a journalist, who's paid to be an analyst, who's an expert source. I can't tell. So confusion, having empathy for that confusion, I think is really, really important. And as an industry, we simply have to take ownership over being clear. Those of us who are clear and who have strong ethics around being honest with people about where we're come from, and who believe that opinion journalism has a place, and that shouldn't influence how people perceive news content, we have a lot of work ahead of us. So one thing that we really, really hope that the entire industry starts to take a closer look at is how we label and package opinion content. A lot of times we rely on conventions that just don't make sense for modern readers, for younger readers, for anyone who didn't grow up with a print newspaper with sections that says this is on the opinion page, the little tiny label at the top of the page that says opinion just doesn't cut it. So here's an example of the right way to do it. Or one solid way to do it. The New York Times has an opinion label above a headline. And then the byline here, as you can see on the left, it says by the editorial board, and there's an actual description underneath it. It's a group of opinion journalists whose views are informed by expertise, research, debate, and certain longstanding values. It is separate from the newsroom. And then the byline, the editorial board, is actually clickable, and you can click through and see more about how it functions and who serves on it and that sort of thing. Very importantly, when you take that link and stick it into Facebook, you get what's on the right, and you can see that opinion label actually migrates to the headline, so that as people are scrolling through and see this story in their feed, they could of course miss it and just not be paying attention. But man, the Times is working hard to make sure that they understand that is content that is designed to persuade. When something doesn't travel automatically, you get the unfortunate thing that happened to the folks at the Indianapolis Star this week, where an automatic tweet posted that shared USA Today's endorsement of Biden. And because there wasn't a label that was stuck in that headline, when you just consume this in your Twitter feed, it looks like the Indy Star is saying, elect Joe Biden, reject Donald Trump, which just does not do any favors. First of all, it didn't even come from their newsroom, it was from USA Today. And it certainly doesn't do any favors to the political news team trying real hard to project fairness in how they're covering things. Kudos to the folks at the Indy Star. They left the tweet up and didn't delete it, and did a solid job responding and engaging. Left in that it was an auto tweet. They put another one up as soon as they noticed it that says it links to an opinion article from the USA Today editorial board. The editorial board is separate from the newsroom. Very important to just be crystal clear about that at every opportunity. One thing that the USA Today web design that has migrated to Gannett newsrooms, one thing it does really, really well is puts an automatic yellow bar at the top of opinion content. It's hard to miss it from a design perspective because it's like it's highlighted at the top of the page and it says this piece expresses the views of its author separate from those of this publication. So I think that's what we need to move to as an industry, is automatic labeling that makes it clear it's separate, that it makes it hard to miss, and that migrates to all social platforms and to all platforms that are just different from, that are just sort of excerpted from the larger context. Like, if you send content to an app, if I listen to NPR One, and sometimes there'll be a first person perspective that made sense in the context of a larger radio program on NPR, but when it shows up atomized in my NPR One app, maybe it comes without that sort of wrap and framing. So I just really encourage you to take a look at everywhere your opinion content goes, and how you can make sure that it would be super hard for someone to miss the fact that it is sharing an opinion on purpose, and that is separate from the efforts of your news reporters. Another just good example of how to do it from Wisconsin Watch. We are actually of the opinion these days that the word opinion at the front of the headline is the clearest way to go. We know that those same people who didn't grow up reading a print newspaper don't necessarily know what a column is, don't necessarily know what a letter to the editor is, certainly don't know what an op-ed is, or an editorial, which if you think about it, is a super confusing word, because if you look at your staff page, I'm gonna guess there's a chance it says editorial department, and that means the newsroom. However, an editorial is a piece of opinion content that is separate from the newsroom. So we just need to stop using jargon and be as crystal clear with folks as we can. And then the last sort of category of tips we want to share with you, and then we'd love to open it up to questions. I'll get back to the chat in a minute. Please start putting your questions there, and you're welcome to just unmute yourself and ask them at the end as well. The last sort of category that we want to cover is this idea of media literacy or news literacy, and how frustrating we know it can be when people have complaints about your coverage that make it clear they just really are not educated news consumers or don't understand what you're doing. And I want to get back to that idea of empathy, because the fact that people don't understand very much about news, we can be frustrated by that, and we can wish that they understood more about our jobs and gave us the benefit of the doubt and had fewer misconceptions about how we do our jobs. But fundamentally, nobody's going to solve this problem but us. And so starting with empathy for that experience, recognizing that it can be really frustrating to know where to put your trust in news coverage and whether something's trustworthy, and that we would like to be a source for not only credible information, but also helping people navigate an information landscape that can feel like it's just full of landmines. So we encourage you to show people how to navigate the news. I'm going to show you a few examples here. I think that it's, several of our newsroom partners expressed, during COVID, during election coverage, that it seems like their audiences are just, so overwhelmed by the barrage of news. There's plenty of research that shows that talks about news fatigue and people's desire just to turn things off, genuine frustration trying to tell what's true. So, we really encourage you to, maybe give your audience advice about when to just stop watching the news. Maybe say, why don't you watch this newscast, subscribe to this newsletter, check in a couple of times a day, and then, recognize that the news doesn't have to be never ending, and that you can feel some comfort and sign off at the end of the day. Maybe you suggest a news diet. Maybe you suggest, we know that we publish a couple hundred stories a day or whatever, and we know that it's a lot. Here are some suggestions for how you can sort of take a breath and protect your sanity. A few examples I want to show you from newsrooms. Minnesota Public Radio, as I mentioned, has just a really wonderful news literacy project that they've been working on. And one of their suggestions is to make people smarter about how to consume Facebook news. People don't understand how the Facebook algorithm works. They don't really understand, a lot of people don't, that they're getting just certain views of stories, that they're not all seeing the same thing. So they wrote a story that says, here's how the algorithm works. Here's how you can retrain your feed if you're not seeing the types of things you want to see. So just really concrete examples about that. The next one is something they wrote as part of their Can You Believe It series that says, here's how to tell if a political poll is credible. Definitely, we encourage you, if you run your own polls or if you just report on political polls, to have a standard box that you run with it that says, here's how we decide which polls to report on. We look at political and financial independence. We pay attention to this. And And, we know it can be frustrating because polls, this idea that polls were all wrong, how do we trust them now? Like, I would address that. 538 has some great information. Pew has some great information. You can borrow from that or link to it, but just help people understand, be smarter about how they consume political polls. And then this last one we wanted to show you is an example from the Washington Post fact checker, where they put together a guide to manipulated video. Here's how people manipulate video. Here's why we're going to break down for you why you can't necessarily trust what you're looking at and how that happens and why it happens. So those are the examples we have to share, and I will put a link to the slide deck in the chat so you can take a closer look at those examples if you want to. Just a few quick links for you here. We do have a weekly newsletter called Trust Tips that shares just one quick actionable tip every Tuesday afternoon. We are running a free SMS, like a text message based class in trustworthy elections. So if you sign up today or tomorrow, you still have time to get all 10 days before the election. It just sends you a message at whatever time of day you choose. And we're also partnering with Election SOS, and there are a ton of resources that you might just want to bookmark, because stuff that, on how to deal with misinformation, what happens if there's violence or civil unrest, problems at the polls, just a ton of archived webinars and resources on their website. And we do invite you to get in touch with us anytime. Our contact information is there. Thank you, and we would love to open it up to questions. I'm going to stick some links in the chat here. Oh, thanks, Matthew, for those comments. That's a good idea to have quote tweeted that bad tweet or screenshot it. You can always share it so that people can tell that you're not trying to hide from it. Matthew, I'd love to know where you work. The challenge in deleting is always that it seems like you're trying to hide from something or run from it. So you can quote tweet it and then delete it, or you can screenshot it and then delete it. That's a smart idea.
Yeah, I'm the editorial and opinion director at the San Diego Union Tribune.
Oh, great. Hi. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, both of you guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I feel like I have both of you guys on speed dial if I wanted to reach out. But I mean, a quick question on opinion content, because that's really intriguing that the notion is just have opinion, our team has, given ourselves headaches trying to figure out how to do that, and eventually came around to labeling everything, but labeling it commentary, editorial, and readers react is how we don't want to call it letters to the editor, because that's kind of an outdated term as well that people don't understand. And so talk to me about the wisdom of using just opinion, because I do think there's a very clear difference between those three things that people need to understand when they're clicking through.
What did you say? Commentary, and yeah. What was the second one you said?
It's basically commentary are expert op-eds or essays. Readers react is what we call letters, which obviously are shorter, and editorials, I still think, that there's a huge reasoning to know that what you're getting is the institution's editorial board. I love what you said about the New York Times. We're trying to do something similar at our shop.
I mean, honestly, I would handle that differentiation in an italicized note at the top of the story. This is an editorial. It represents the views of these people. This is a section where readers can react and submit your own view here. In terms of in the headline, though, I mean, whose commentary? Do you know how hard it is sometimes even to tell, is this like an opinion columnist from the newspaper? Is it the state senator and I just forgot her name and she's writing something? Like, it is so hard to tell. And I think that if you polled readers, you might be surprised how few of them have any idea what those different words mean. I think we rely on a lot of jargon and conventions that just don't make sense to the public. So we have seen people where like the name of a columnist, a longtime sports columnist or political columnist is important. We have had some newsrooms say like opinion / and a last name, and then a colon in the rest of the headline. It gets a little cumbersome, but we'd be happy to talk more with you offline about options for that. But unless you really think that the word commentary or editorial or op-ed or reader react, like unless you think that that means the same thing to your audience that you do to you, that it does to you, I would just be super cautious.
Yeah, no, that's great. And one of the last things we've done recently is have just the name of the person, because we use a lot of outside voices. We have a community advisory board that's just 60 people from our community writing about anything they want. And so we're trying to build their brand and standing, and we use their names.
But what does that signify? Like, I think at the top of the story, that's fantastic. But in the headline, as people are deciding whether to click, does that signify what you think it means? Especially because people consume, I'm going to share a local columnist here. I did this morning on my Facebook page, share something from a local columnist. Well, nobody in the rest of my Facebook feed who doesn't live in Sarasota, Florida has any idea who that person is. And casual readers, which is such a huge percentage, non-subscribers, casual readers, they just don't, it just doesn't signify anything to them. It doesn't help them make a decision about what they're consuming.
Yeah,
And I
our
think
thinking.
the one thing I would just add, I think that's just important to keep in mind with this is, you know, in print, this may not be as necessary, right? Like, because people are used to seeing everything on one page. This is really for the digital audience who's getting their news from social, or who's seeing a push alert that might be sent, or who's seeing someone share something, or who's going to your website. Maybe they're Googling something and it pops up. People do not know what op-ed means. For the most part. I'm teaching a class this semester, and I think I had 2 students out of 20 say that they knew what that meant. And so that's just, that's a low number. And so those kind of basic understandings, like the word opinion, just, it screams opinion. And it's kind of also, I think, making our lives easier, because and then we don't have to explain, oh, this is someone's opinion. I mean, you might still, but you're kind of putting it out there. So it's kind of as crystal clear as it can be.
Yeah, I guess our
Remember what I said about I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, our thinking was, by saying a name, it gets right to what both you were saying. And Lynn, on social media, sharing a news story says your assumption is it's a news story, which is why the Indy Star had problems with that endorsement, right? And how it was shared. But when you have a name colon, even if they don't know who the name is, at least they know that it's someone's opinion saying it, right?
Yep.
But whether you do it or not, there is a news convention also where that's the name of a source.
Yep.
Walsh, colon,
good point.
that tax will never pass, right?
That's a good point. Yeah,
so
thanks you guys. I really appreciate it.
Again, it's like shorthand.
Yeah. No.
And remember our newsroom partner who said, somebody said the restaurant reviewer was too biased. So like, whatever page furniture is on that page that says this is a review, which that's a crystal clear word to me. Of course I know what a review is, and that you're reviewing how good something is, which means you have an opinion about that. It's just still not clear. Kristen has a good question. Kristen from Reno, she says, a reader emailed saying a story I wrote was full of misinformation, but she didn't want to communicate any further about specifics. How should I move forward? So one thing it's really important to remember is that we exist within this larger information climate, and we are part of the media. No matter what we do, like as frustrating as that is, and all the irresponsible things that fall under that big umbrella, we're part of it. And so what we're trying to do is tell the story about our work and differentiate ourselves from the less responsible actors. And so it could be, Kristen, that the reader who emailed you is holding you accountable for, is confused about what the information was, doesn't have anything specific, just doesn't like the tone of the story, or assumes that maybe she thought that because you were covering the story, that you had the wrong take on this, that by highlighting something, you must agree with something or have the wrong take on something. If she won't provide you with specifics, there's nothing else you can do there. But I do think that it's worth, and if it's in an email and they don't respond once, I would let that go. What we really do advocate for responding publicly though, because you're responding not just to that reader who doesn't have any specifics, but to anyone else who might be following along. So when you can say, like, acknowledge, we know there's a lot of, it can be really frustrating to tell what's credible. We work really hard to include only factual information. You can trust that if when we're alerted to errors, we correct it publicly and prominently. And so please, if there is something wrong, we really do need you to let us know so that we can address it. Like, just being on the record as redundantly as you can with that. You could make social posts from time to time and put comments under stories that just reinforce that idea. There's plenty of research that shows if you correct things publicly, it actually increases trust. So look for chances to remind your audience, the people you aim to serve, about your ethics and your high standards. But if somebody won't provide specifics, then all you can do is indicate your willingness, to your desire to hear if there is something wrong, and then assume that either they don't have anything to say or that it's not worthwhile to them.
Yeah, the other thing I would add, and again, I know you don't necessarily maybe have time for this, but one, I think you did the right thing by kind of responding and asking for more information. Joy's absolutely right. Like, you don't, because you have nothing to go off of, you don't know, but it might be worth maybe Googling and seeing in your area if there is anything related to whatever the topic was. I don't know, that people are sharing related to this locally. Like, is there something in a Facebook group that's kind of maybe gaining traction related to the topic or the specific story that you wrote about? And maybe that's kind of just something to kind of keep note of, okay, if you find something related to your topic that is misinformation or disinformation kind of spreading, or a conspiracy theory or something, might just be good to be aware of it and see if it does gain more traction. And maybe that's when you're kind of monitoring it, like, maybe we should address this if you see more and more people kind of talking about something related to that. But again, like right now, time is precious. So you might not have time to do that. But if you do, that could be kind of another kind of next step.
And that's why we encourage you to prioritize public communication as well. And if you do spend time responding thoughtfully to a reader about something, maybe you can get more bang for your buck if you share that in a public comment as well. Like, we got asked this question by a reader, thought other people might be wondering the same thing. Here's what we said. Just try to, it can make, we know this engagement takes a lot of time, and you can get more efficient at it over time if you copy and paste your responses into a Google Doc or a Slack channel and say, hey, if you ever get this question, here's how I responded, so that your colleague or you a week from now, when you get the same question, don't have to hunt for that or start from scratch writing it. And just try to, when you do take the time to respond, think about how that answer might be useful to you or your colleagues in the future.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Please do feel free to add a question in the chat, or if you have something and you want to unmute yourself, we'd be glad to take that now too.
There is actually one more there.
Oh, there is.
It
Okay.
says, Neil says, have you looked much at how often journalists are attributing information? I sometimes see stories that lack sufficient attribution. I actually see, Neil, that's not something that we study at Trusting News, but I do think it contributes. What I've seen this play out in the news versus opinion conversation, because sometimes people, when journalists maybe provide a newsletter that's written with a little more voice or a little more sort of analysis or context, and the journalist then feels freer to share kind of an analysis of the situation, and doesn't attribute as closely because some of it's their take on things, I think that can contribute to the sense that that the journalist's opinion is what's driving the content. In news stories, I do think that journalists need to be more careful with sourcing and with attribution. And I think we use a lot of shorthand, like, a source close to the administration reveals this or something, in a way that just doesn't make sense to most people. But we do not look specifically we don't do like content analysis of sourcing or attribution.
No, but I think that's just a good reminder, especially with political stories, that, as you are, especially if you're doing anything where you're asking people's opinion on something, maybe it's like in television, they would call it like man on the street interviews, or you're maybe just in the voter line, right? As people are waiting to vote, and you're asking them about who they're voting for and why, and you're going to include that in the story, which is a typical kind of story that can be a good story to do, making sure that you are attributing that to the individual. Because I have heard from people that they might say that your story, those type of stories, might be biased because of what those people are saying. And they kind of think that, that you as the reporter believe that because you're putting those people in there saying that. And so again, it's just kind of making sure, one, that attribution is crystal clear. And maybe it is something, especially on air or in newsletters, like where you can be more conversational, say, so we went out and again, we talked to these people to hear their thoughts. These are their thoughts. This is not what we believe, but we want to share these with you because we think it's important that we all kind of understand what people are thinking, what their opinions are. So just kind of adding that type of thing can really be helpful, because sometimes it can be seen as bias if that attribution isn't clear. And just, again, people not reading closely or seeing a clip of what the full story was. So just doing some more of that explanation can help. And it can be conversational, I think, on air and in newsletters and in social posts.
Yeah, sometimes people assume that by us shining a light on something, we're endorsing it. Like, here's people who think this thing, and people say, oh my gosh, you're so biased. Why would you write that story? Or why would you produce that story? And so I think just reminding people when you can, like, our goal is to help you understand what's happening in your community. And so with that in mind, we went out to talk to people.
Something else, Joy, I know you and I have talked about, again, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, but something that I think with the election that we're kind of anticipating and or might see is, especially if you're a local news organization, you don't have the manpower or the reporters and all of these people to maybe cover the national races, and you probably are going to be relying on AP content, wire content, CNN or your company or your corporate offices, right, to do that coverage. And so I think explaining that is going to be really helpful, because if someone is seeing people share a story on Facebook or on Twitter or on social media, or getting text from a friend about something, right? And then they don't see you talking about it locally, they might assume that you're not doing that because you're biased toward one of the candidates nationally. So I think it is really important to kind of have that explanation front and center on election stories. Like, here's our approach, here are the types of stories that you are covering, and why they're not going to see everything. And to kind of be very specific, like, we're your one go-to spot for local content, local races. This is what we're focusing on. Yes, we will give some updates on the national races, but really our focus is local, and it's because we're based here and we care that you guys have the most updated information here in this community.
A lot of what you're held accountable for and what you might see in your comments is reactions to national coverage. And that could be from wire or syndicated content, whether you run Washington Post, CNN, Associated Press content. And so it can be, there can be a really good opportunity in reminding people that that's something that you trust that content and you bring it to them as a service, but that it's not something independently reported by people in your newsroom, and remind people what your this sort of scope of your coverage is. Awesome. Well, I stuck a link in the chat to our Medium publication. We are wrapping up production on a Medium post that pulls together just a whole series of tips for election coverage. We're trying to make it scannable so you can find just the parts that are relevant to you, that we think are most relevant for the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye there, or follow us on Twitter if you want to see that. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for your time.
Thanks
here,
everyone so much. Yes. If you have other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us as well, at Trusting News on Twitter, or you can reach out to us individually as well. So we appreciate your time, and good luck. Keep up the great work. It's important work. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for all you're doing.